Welcome to Bringing Back the Wild. In each episode, Mike Arnold explores how science, tradition, and hands-on conservation come together to protect the wild places and wildlife we care about. Your host, Mike Arnold, is a professor of genetics, a lifelong hunter, and a conservation biologist. On this podcast, Mike dives into the science and stories behind bringing wildlife species back and keeping wild places wild. Sponsors of Bringing Back the Wild are Dallas Safari Club, conserving wildlife, engaging the public, and ensuring the future. Lifeform Taxidermy, guardian of the hunter's dreams. Zambezi Delta Safaris, protecting wildlife, empowering communities, and defining adventure. Royal Outfitters UK, tradition in the field and excellence in the hunt. Choctaw Hunting Lodge, native land, exceptional wildlife, unforgettable hunts. Now here's your host, Mike Arnold.
Welcome to Bringing Back the Wild. This episode is another great one. Erica Tergeson is a political strategist and spokesperson for a number of organizations and also the political machinery in Washington, D.C., a very important key person for many of our groups that we care about. Erica, thank you for being here. Welcome to Bringing Back the Wild.
You bet. It's an honor.
I know you're a hunter. How did you get into hunting?
I did it I would say the family traditional way. My dad and my brother's a little bit younger than me. He's 3 years younger than me. And we grew up getting a Ruger 22 rifle when I think I was 9 or 10 years old. My brother was probably a little younger, and learned how to shoot, and then went out hunting. And my dad's way to introduce us to that was to hunt prairie dogs. I'll be honest and say that at first, being a little girl, I thought the prairie dogs were pretty cute, but then it also ended up being a lot of fun. And I also, growing up on a ranch, knew what they did to our cattle. Anyway, that's how I was introduced. And then because I grew up on a ranch, there's not all that much time on a ranch because you're always busy with something or some crisis or another. So hunting fit in between when we could do it. Or we would run across a lot of predators, varmints, that type of thing. So that's really how I got my start.
So what was your first big game animal or small game animal that y'all did utilize for food?
Yeah, utilize for food. We ate beef.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be honest about that. We never ate wild game growing up because we were big beef producers. So that's something I did later on in life. We would hunt deer, for example, whitetail, and donate the meat. But when I first did my own and field dressed my own and then prepared it myself, that kind of took everything to a whole new level for me in hunting. I think a lot of people have that experience than just taking it to the processor. So that, I don't know, it gives you this sense of self-worth and self-reliance, I think, that you otherwise wouldn't have. But I discovered that later on in life. It wasn't something my family did.
So when you say you deer hunted, I don't know where you grew up. Where was this?
I grew up in Colorado.
So was it mule deer or whitetail or both?
It was whitetail. There was a decent amount of whitetail where I grew up, just south of Cheyenne. Mule deer, not as much, but you'd have to go into the mountains for that a little bit more. I still haven't gotten an elk, if you can believe that, growing up in Colorado. But again, growing up on the ranch, you couldn't necessarily, we didn't even take Christmas off so that came first. Hunting came secondary to that. And if ran across something great while you were working at the ranch, but otherwise work is first. So
yeah, I grew up on a quarter horse ranch, and we raised quarter horses and broke them to saddle for cutting and for racing. Well, I was in Texas, West Texas. They would end up in New Mexico a lot of times for quarter horse racing. But it was the same way. The horses had to be fed. Their stalls had to be cleaned out. Didn't matter if it was Christmas. They still needed food and water.
Yeah. In fact, growing up, I remember a lot of the kids at school didn't want to come over to my house after school because my dad would always make them work. You would see a bunch of kids, extra hands, and he'd say, "Hey, while you guys are here, we have this little project and we'll get it done so much faster with you here." When I'd invite them, they'd say, "No, your dad will make us work. We don't want to come to your house."
Oh, I loved working on ranches and farms, but my brother and I were weird that way.
Yeah, we didn't know any better either.
We loved it.
Yeah.
Now, so in terms of hunting now, what do you do?
I'm actually going to Namibia for the first time in May, so I'm really looking forward to that. I've been to Africa, but I have not hunted there. And what I've been doing, I have a farm in Northern Virginia, so I do hunt white-tailed deer just to fill my freezer here on my own farm and some other little varmints. And I have to, if I'm being honest, my favorite rifle is my 30-30 that I grew up with. As you can imagine, I'm very comfortable with that. I have nicer, more expensive rifles, but that one is my favorite. And in Virginia, we're not shooting plus 100 yards here. It's really close. So anyway, I do whitetail, and then I actually have a group of girlfriends, and quarterly we'll try to get together and do some type of hunting excursion. And we do some very non-traditional things from DSC standards, like we went to the Everglades and on an invasive species kick. So we did python in the Everglades, which was interesting. But then we also do, I'd say, a lot of whitetail for the most part. We try to go to Texas and hunt some exotics there too. But that would also upland bird. I love doing that, and that's easy. I can do that around here. I end up doing a lot of that for work, actually, which is lovely. So
That is lovely. So what are you hunting in Namibia?
I don't even know yet, Mike, and that is because I have been so busy on Capitol Hill. So I will look at it very soon to see what it is I want to do. More like, what is my budget, and to not bust the budget when I'm there. But I'm honestly just excited to go and just to have that opportunity because I still have not done that.
One last question about Namibia. Who are you hunting with?
I'm going to Denine's
Okay.
place. Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And I've heard that it's fantastic. And I will not be, to clarify for the DSC crowd, I will not be doing any dangerous game yet. So, yeah, dipping my toe in before I get into any of that.
Yeah, I did my leopard hunt back in 2020, actually. Got onto a mainly empty plane to fly to Namibia. It was lovely. It was the only country I could get into. I was supposed to be going to Mozambique to do the research for my book with Mark Haldane, but it was closed. Mozambique was closed, as were most other countries. So your political strategist position and spokesperson position, I assume, really does center around Washington. And why should hunters care about what happens in Washington, D.C.? I love Washington, D.C. as a tourist, but I wouldn't want to work there.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that I care enough about this.
I completely understand that. I'd say, especially coming from my background, when I graduated from college, I went to Colorado State and I went to Washington, D.C. to work for my local congressman because I was involved in FFA, for example. And I really wanted to protect our way of life, seeing how things were changing. And that's why I went to D.C. I thought I would come home after a year, and I didn't. I just stayed because I loved it. Now, do I love DC? It's a nice town. I'm not a town person. I'm a country person. I figured out that balance 20 years later when I moved to DC. However, I do love working on Capitol Hill. I love solving problems. And I serve as the government affairs director for DSC. Why does it matter to people, and why should they care? Everybody who comes to DC with DSC sees what goes on and why it's so important. The rule in Washington is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And if you look at the dollars that are raised by animal rights activists versus we give away all of our money and we spend it towards conservation. a lot of the very large animal rights groups are spending most of their money either on supporting animal rights type candidates or they're spending it on lobbying on Capitol Hill. We spend far less on that than they do, into a quarter of what I think the hunting community spends compared to the animal rights community. They're working every single day to outlaw hunting. And they do it through, they don't outright say, oh, we're going to get rid of whitetail hunting, because they know that America would freak out about something like that, quite honestly. But they nibble at the edges, right? Just like we saw with wolf in Colorado. We also saw the big cat ban they were trying to push through in Colorado. There's plenty of other states where they've taken more of the iconic species and used those as the poster child. And since we have such a divide now with rural and urban voters, the urban voters see one commercial and think, wow, why are we killing those beautiful animals? So that's what I'm fighting against every day. Specifically, especially for DSC members, we faced the Cecil the lion problem. Now that's probably almost 10 years ago now, thank goodness. But that was a real issue. And as a result, we had a bill that passed the House that would have basically banned hunting. You could go over and hunt in Africa, but you couldn't bring your legally harvested wildlife home with you. And that's an issue. You know, you paid a lot of money for that animal and you should be able to bring it home with you. And you got all the permits and everything you needed. And we all know, even if you're abiding by the law, it's still difficult to bring them home in some cases. So that is what I am working on in DC. And it's educating members. They have no idea, most of them, how our Pittman-Robertson funding works, that 78% of shooters purchase ammunition and firearms, and they don't even hunt. Yet that money still goes to the Pittman-Robertson Fund that in turn goes and funds our state wildlife agencies. And I think even there's quite a few hunters that don't even realize that's the case either. So it's educating them on the North American model without boring them on the North American model.
Yeah.
We love to talk about it, but to the average voter or the average member of Congress in DC, you have to realize they've got 1,000 issues they're trying to solve on their list. So how do you make hunting important to them? And that's what we strive to do. And most of all, the good news is in DC, we're basically playing defense. So we're trying to stop bad legislation from happening. That's a lot easier than trying to pass bills through DC, as most of you have heard about the political logjam that we have right now.
So, in terms of the Pittman-Robertson, explaining a little bit further, the fact that it goes to the Treasury, but it can't be touched by the federal government except to be dispersed to all of our states, depending on numbers of hunting licenses and population. But do you ever work at the state level? Is that ever something that you end up being called to do apologetics, basically, for us hunters?
It would be too much. And I'll just say, in my previous life, I worked for the National Rifle Association, and I handled hunting policy for them. And there, because they had lobbyists in every state and they had lobbyists at the federal level, I was able to do both the state and the federal piece. With DSC, that's more difficult. And that's why we have partnerships with Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, for example, because they have lobbyists in the states. But we will get involved, especially like in the trophy import ban. We've been fighting that in New York and California. We just got involved with an issue in Tennessee. We try to be supportive where we can, but there are just so many issues going on that I am mostly focused at the federal level. We did
Sure.
play with wolves in Colorado, for example. Anything that's on the ballot, we're certainly going to send a notice out to our members to make them aware and to tell them they need to vote, that type of thing. But at the state level, it's difficult to do both.
When you spend a day on Capitol Hill, Let's unpack that for a moment. What does that look like? Do you have a typical day?
Huh, no, I don't. And actually, I had a great intern this summer, and she said, "What's a typical day like for you?" And I said, "There really isn't one." And after a month with me, she said, "Wow, you're right. You just never know." So I'll give you an example. A lot of what I do is I'll meet with the two committees of jurisdiction that matter to wildlife and hunting issues. And that would be the Natural Resources Committee in the House and the Interior Appropriations Committee. That's the committee that funds the Department of the Interior and the Forest Service, for example. So those are the two committees of jurisdiction that I'll meet with on the House side. There are other committees, EPW, the Environment and Public Works in the Senate, and then also the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee. So I'll get to know those members. I will attend fundraisers for them, for example, so they are supported by us and know who we are, talk about policy. And then there's all of the other members of Congress. So, of course, we talk a lot to members of the Texas delegation, Oklahoma delegation, and then wherever we have chapters, I try to reach out to those members of Congress too. We're talking 100 senators, 400 plus members of Congress. There's no way you can reach them all. So you try to do your best and be strategic. Get close to the chairman, for example, the subcommittee chairman. And then we just have those champions, the type of folks like Richard Hudson that we've given the Bull Elephant Award to. He's
Right.
not on any committees that help us, but when we need his help, we call him up and he's helping us at the highest levels. I was in the midst of a lot of meetings on this, and then that's when screwworm, for example, the New World screwworm issue really started coming to a head again. And that led me down a completely different role of working with USDA, for example, where we normally don't talk too much to USDA, but now I'll be meeting with them this week to monitor what they're doing on screwworm, see how we can help, and also try to shove them in the right direction.
Does it help for members of DSC to become involved to the extent of coming to Washington, D.C.? Is that of use at all? Is there something that we should be aware of that we should be coming to Washington, D.C. for some reason?
Yeah, I tell everybody if you have an interest, let me know. Or if you're in the area and you want to go to Capitol Hill for a day or a half a day, I'm happy to take you there. Members of Congress want to meet with the people who elect them. It's what's the number one rule of a politician or the number one goal? Get reelected.
Mm.
And you do that by the people who vote for you, not the lobbyists like me. So they will meet with me, yes, and that's my job, but they really want to hear what's going on in their district and what the people in their district care about. And that carries a lot of weight. It also opens doors to members of the Northeast chapter, for example. Those are not folks that are really paying a lot of attention and politicians to hunting. So we can open those doors because they have a constituent coming in to talk about how important hunting is to them. So it's actually crucial to have that kind of participation from our members.
Does it help to reach across the aisle? Because we have, from Georgia, we have very liberal representatives
Yeah.
from my state where I live. And in all states, probably that's the case. You have a mixture. Would it help for someone like me to come and meet with representatives who probably don't think like I do?
It is helpful. It depends on whether or not we can get a meeting, honestly. Some people just won't meet with us,
Mm.
which is fine. But yes, it is. You have to try to make that effort, especially if you're a constituent. So it's very important, especially, but somebody like you, Mike, would be great because of your background, of your credentials. That carries a little more weight with those offices, I would say. So that would be helpful. We just do the best that we can. We are in a very polarized political environment. We would love to be more bipartisan. It's just not the way that the Congress breaks down right now. Unfortunately, we're going through a time of change politically, socially right now, and that's what happens. I always like to look at what happened around the Civil War. I don't want to compare what we're going through now necessarily to then, but if you want to look at the political rhetoric, if you look at some of it around the Civil War, it was a lot worse, I think, than it was today. So you realize we have been through hard times before. We're going to go through them again, but that's what we're in the midst of. But yes, we do our best to reach out. One thing we do that has really helped is in Wyoming, the Wyoming County Commissioners put together a pot of money every year. And in August, they get staffers from urban districts, both Republicans and Democrats, to come out to Wyoming and to learn about everything in the state, from oil and gas and grazing, everything that Wyoming does, basically. DSC sponsors a dinner there. I give a presentation on Pittman-Robertson and just hunting in general. And it is invaluable because we have a lot of staffers there that are from very liberal districts that are very urban, and they've never even been out to the country for the most part. And sometimes they get to shoot. Last year, they got to shoot suppressed for the first time.
Huh.
And a lot of them shot 50 caliber, which I was a little worried about, but the Wyomingites were not. But in any event, they talk to me afterwards and just say, wow, thank you so much for the information. We had no idea. Getting them out of D.C. is very helpful, as you can imagine, because in D.C., everybody's stuck in their own little corner. So
Yeah.
that's how we try to reach out.
So you've mentioned, and this may sound like a naive question, but you've mentioned the polarization. Why is it polarized right now? And is there anything we can do about that as Dallas Safari Club, but also as hunters, as voters?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just how our system is based too, because to the victor goes the spoils. So, if the Republicans are in charge of Congress, they're in charge of the whole agenda. And that makes for wanting to have a Republican majority if you're a Republican, and vice versa if you're a Democrat. And I have a lot of people that come to DC who just graduated from college and they want to work on the Hill. And I say, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And they say, I don't know. And I said, you got to pick a side because that's how it works in DC. There isn't any in the middle. There's no real independent party. So that is the case. At the same time, we are growing more and more polarized because of this urban-rural divide. I think the rapid rate of change, all of those things. And the only thing that we can continue to do is to try to be understanding of what the other side thinks and try to work with them where we can. And that's the best you can do. And rather than adding fuel to the fire of the extremes of either party, trying to be the radical center that says, let's sit down and listen to each other and talk about ideas and get back to maybe where we were 20 years ago when you could actually talk about these things and not be canceled.
So, are there organizations that you work with within the hunting and shooting realm that are political that do have members from both parties who are trying to work together, at least in support of hunters?
Say DSC tries to do as much of that as we can based in Texas. That makes it a little difficult. But we do have some Texas members, Texas Democrats that we work with. They're still a little different breed and tend to be pro hunting. Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation does a great job because they're a nonprofit and because they have a caucus, which means anybody can join the caucus in the House and in the Senate. As a member of Congress, you just say, I would like to join this. And because of that, they have quite a large following of bipartisan members. And they have co-chairs, so they have one Republican, one Democrat, which really helps. It tries to foster some of that discussion. They have events where everybody gets together. We're a big sponsor of CSF, so we attend those events. And that's a great place to be able to reach out to some of those members that normally we wouldn't have access to.
Friends, if you haven't hunted whitetail at Choctaw Hunting Lodge, you simply haven't hunted whitetail. This place changes how you define the hunt and how often you return. Now, in addition to politicians, you also rub elbows and have influence and interactions with other folks who are in DC. For example, I received a message last night, an email from the ambassador from Tanzania, who you put me into contact with. And I met her at the DSC PAC mixer when we were at the convention. And she is going to come on the podcast, and it's just wonderful. But you were telling me that you do know her and that she is supportive. How do you make those kinds of connections?
I've been with DSC about 4 years now. They already had those connections and had made those connections. We invite all the ambassadors from wherever we have exhibitors to our show. It's very important revenue to Africa. So they're very engaged and want to see DSC be successful. So that's where I met Ambassador Kanza. But you get to know the diplomats as well. And they're lovely people because they're diplomats. So they're easy to talk to and they're fun and they have great stories. She is one of the stars, I would say. She's an incredible woman. But that's how I get to meet them. I will meet with them in DC as well. But really, the best role for them is when we are fighting some of these bans, for example, in Africa. I, as a white girl from Colorado, just being honest, can go and talk to the Congress about this, but they have so much more credibility coming from their countries, explaining the impact, how their hunting systems are set up. That's so much more effective than someone from the United States trying to tell other people from the United States what's going on in Africa. So that's where we can really utilize and work with them. They do work their diplomatic channels, trying to fix a lot of the problems that exist now. But it is a real concern with China and Africa now, with the way that we're seeing how the world is going to reorganize itself in terms of power. Right now, the power struggle between Russia and China and the United States and where that goes, I am concerned about the future of Africa. So that is how we try to work with the ambassadors. And there are a lot of other folks, the professional hunters associations as well, to make sure that they continue to have this amazing hunting conservation story.
So I know you say you don't have a typical day, but do you have a 5-year plan? I'm not really talking about personally per se, but can you have a 5-year or a 2-year or a 1-year plan as, okay, we're really going to focus on this?
You can. It has to be, I would say, at a very high level. And then the strategy to get there changes by the week, probably, depending on what happens. So, number one for me is first do no harm. So, our number one goal is defense, not making it any more difficult to hunt abroad or in the United States than it already is. So, that's number one. And then number two is offense. So, right now we're on offense. That may change after the elections, but we're working with the Department of the Interior, for example, on permitting, on the exotic issue, which is a big deal for a lot of states, making that permitting make more sense so that non-native species isn't treated like an endangered species here in the US, since it's not indigenous to the United States. Doesn't make any sense, but it's still regulated that way. So trying to fix a lot of those issues through Congress, where you get, for example, report language that's added to the funding bills. So that means that there are strings tied to the dollars that go to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And Fish and Wildlife Service realizes, okay, Congress cares about this issue, so we better pay attention to it. So there's little things like that. And then there are big things like overall Endangered Species Act reform, which we've been supporting and working on for many years. Wolf delisting, grizzly bear delisting, those are the big items that we hope to accomplish in the next 3 years. But the actual strategy on how to get there changes by the week.
What else would you like to tell us, Erica? Anything else that you would like to fill the listeners on?
Yeah, the only other thing I would like to mention is DSC's, our Political Action Committee. It's confusing to a lot of people. Of course, the federal government made it that way. So not surprising. But a political action committee serves one purpose, and that is to support candidates, federal candidates that are up for election in federal elections, House and Senate, essentially. The money that goes to that PAC, that's all it can be used for. So it doesn't go to my salary. It doesn't go to DSC in general. It is only used for political contributions and some of the expenses associated with that. An individual can only give $5,000 to the PAC. So whereas we look at a lot of our very high donors who are very generous to DSC, they can't solve the problem of just writing a big check to the PAC because they can only give a maximum of $5,000 a year. And that really is how we have political power in DC. Unfortunately, money talks. That's just the way the system works. And our animal rights folks have PACs that are nearing $1 million to give to folks. Ours is about $100,000 per cycle to give to pro-hunting candidates. So that's the way we really have power. So I would encourage folks to go on our website. It's biggamepac.org. But anyway, any gift is appreciated from $25 to $5,000. Every little bit helps us in the elections to support candidates who have our back in DC.
I would encourage folks to go to biggame.org and check it out, the DSC site, but also, as Erica mentioned, to look at the PAC site and give generously because it is so critical for us. The laws count and the politicians really count as to whether we're going to keep our legacy that Erica and I both grew up with and so many other folks did as well and cherish. Erica, thank you for being with us. And I bet that you have some other things you have to do today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Erica. And you have a good rest of the day. And I look forward to seeing you in July at the Dallas Gala.
I will be there.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If this conversation meant something to you, please follow Bringing Back the Wild so you don't miss future episodes. Consider leaving a rating or sharing the podcast with someone who cares about wildlife and conservation. You can also visit MikeArnoldOutdoors.com for stories from the field, conservation-driven articles, and information about my books. I'm Mike Arnold. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.